The border crossing had 73 witnesses. The treaty delegation, the honor guard, the enemy kingdom's receiving party. The official scribes recording the handover for both courts' permanent records. 73 people who watched the Omega woman walk forward from Daran's side of the border line toward the enemy delegation's waiting formation. Who watched her cross the stone marker that divided the two kingdoms. Who were prepared to witness her receipt as confirmation that the treaty's terms had been honored. She crossed the line. She took 4 more steps. And then she was not there. Not running, not fleeing, not ducking behind someone. Not moving in any direction that the 73 witnesses could follow. Simply ceasing to be visible. The shadow of the border crossing's stone archway taking her with the specific naturalness of a door accepting a hand, the darkness finding her or her finding it. The distinction irrelevant because the result was the same. She was gone. The enemy delegation's commander said, to the silence, "Where is she?" No one answered. This started 2 weeks ago, when a king decided she was his most expendable asset. Which country are you listening from right now? Please drop it in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story reaches. Vale had been in Daran's court for 3 years when she was selected for the trade. She had arrived through the standard assignment process, the specific administrative mechanism by which the kingdom's Omega members were placed in positions that matched their assessed gift profiles and their political standing. Her assessed gift profile had been minor, environmental sensitivity, specifically an enhanced spatial awareness in enclosed spaces that made her useful in the court's cartographic archive division, where precise memory of complex spatial layouts was a genuine skill. Her political standing had been low, no significant pack affiliation, no notable family connection. The specific combination of factors that placed her in the administrative category of people whose value was functional rather than strategic. She had organized maps for 3 years. She had been very good at it. Not because the gift was minor. The gift was not minor, had never been minor. Would not have been classified as minor if she had disclosed it accurately. The gift was the specific tool she had spent her entire adult life learning not to show to people who held authority over her. For reasons that 3 years in Daran's court had not changed her assessment of. She had disclosed the spatial awareness aspect because it was true and because it had a practical application that made her placement comprehensible to the administrative system. She had not disclosed the shadow walking because shadow walking was the specific kind of capacity that produced, in people who govern by visibility and control, the specific fear that invisible people produced. She had watched what happened to practitioners of invisible gifts in courts that could not assess them. She had drawn her own conclusions. The court's daily life had continued around her with the specific quality of institutional rhythm. The meetings and the formal sessions and the social hierarchies and the specific visible performances of status that courts ran on. She had moved through all of it with the shadow gift's passive level operating continuously, feeling the darkness of every corridor she walked through, reading the shadow architecture of every room she entered, building the specific comprehensive spatial awareness of every part of the palace that the gift produced as a byproduct of simply existing in the world. She had known the palace better than most of its long-standing residents. She had known, from the shadow's specific whisper, which corridors saw the most unguarded conversation. She had known which meeting rooms had the shadow corners that made voices carry toward the far wall without the speakers noticing. She had known, with the specific precision of someone whose gift was built for exactly this purpose, where every important thing in the palace happened, and how to be near it without being visible. She had used none of this. She had organized maps. The assessment process had taken one day. Daran's senior administrator had convened the court's Omega population, 14 members in formal, ranking order, and had walked through the criteria with the specific professional neutral tone of someone conducting an administrative process they had been instructed to conduct and had no particular feeling about. Strategic alliance value, pack affiliation, gift profile classification, political connection, health record, each criterion assigned a numerical weight, each member's score calculated. She had known, before the process completed, what her score would be. She had scored lowest. The administrator had said, to her specifically, with the specific careful language of institutional communication, "You have been selected to serve the diplomatic terms of the Eastern Treaty as the kingdom's representative tribute." He had said, "The formal handover will occur in 14 days." He had said, "You will receive preparation materials regarding the Eastern Court's protocols." She had said, "I understand." She had said it with the specific composure of someone who had known this was the category into which she had been sorted and was not going to perform devastation for an audience that would not know what to do with it. She had gone back to the cartographic archive that afternoon and had finished the map she was working on, a detailed spatial record of the Northern Territory's river system. The kind of careful methodical work that the archive division depended on, and that she did better than anyone else in the division, and that would need to be assigned to someone else in 14 days. She had completed the map. She had begun, in the margins of her preparation time over the following 2 weeks, to think very carefully about the Eastern Court's palace layout and what a person with her specific gift could accomplish inside it if they arrived there with the specific advantage of being underestimated. The gift had activated at age 8 in a barn. She had been hiding from her older brother, the specific earnest hiding of a child who had turned concealment into a game and was very good at the game, in the back corner of a barn where the hay was stacked and the light from the single window did not reach. She had been in shadow, and the shadow had done something that shadow did not ordinarily do. It had accepted her. Not metaphorically, not in the way of a shadow providing visual cover. Literally, her body had become part of the darkness the way sound became part of silence. And her brother had walked past the exact corner where she was standing 3 times, close enough to touch her, and had not seen her. She had been 8 years old, and had understood nothing except that she had done something, and should not tell anyone about it. She had spent the following 12 years learning what the something was. The passive level she had understood first because it was always running, the constant awareness of shadow as a navigable substance, the specific sensation of darkness as something with texture and depth and direction. Other people experienced darkness as the absence of light. She experienced it as a specific presence with its own properties, its own architecture, its own language that she had been learning since she was 8 and was now fluent in. She could feel shadow the way a musician felt rhythm, in the specific part of her awareness that processed the world. Darkness was never simply dark. It was structured, directional, connected. A network of navigable spaces that ordinary people moved through without perceiving. The active level had come at 14, on a night when she had been somewhere she was not supposed to be and had needed, with the specific desperation of a teenager in a genuinely dangerous situation, to not be found. She had entered the shadow with the same instinct that had operated at 8 in the barn. Not a decision, a reaching, and had moved through the darkness of the corridor. She was in with the specific fluid freedom of something finally operating at its natural mode. She had moved 50 feet down a corridor past 6 people, without a single one of them perceiving her. She had stood in the darkness at the corridor's end and understood, fully and completely, and with the specific crystalline clarity that genuine understanding produced, what she was. She had also understood, with the same clarity, that telling anyone was inadvisable. The mechanics of the active level, as she had mapped them over 14 years of practice. Entry into shadow required contact with existing darkness. She could not create shadow, could only use what existed, which meant full daylight in an open exterior was the gift's only genuine limitation. Interior spaces at any hour were viable because interior spaces always had shadow somewhere. And shadow was connected. The darkness behind one piece of furniture communicated with the darkness under a table, which communicated with the shadow in a corner, which communicated with the darkness of an unlit corridor. She could move through this network without sound, without scent, without visual presence, for as long as she needed. The dream link was the capacity she had discovered last and used least. She had found it at 22, when the specific grief of losing someone she had loved had produced in her a need to reach across distance that ordinary communication could not serve. And she had tried to send her feeling through the shadow the way she sent herself, and had discovered that shadow, connected across distance, could carry not just her body but her intention, her information, her mind's content, projected through the darkness to someone sleeping, delivered as a dream so vivid and specific that the recipient could not distinguish it from experience. The cost, the dream link at full deployment, projecting a complex, detailed, information-dense intelligence package across hundreds of miles to a sleeping mind, was the most expensive thing she had ever done with the gift. The recovery took days. The depletion was profound. She had used it twice in her life before the trade, both times for small transmissions, and had been clear with herself about what the full deployment at intelligence scale would cost. She had decided, before she arrived in the enemy court, that the cost was acceptable if the intelligence was sufficient. She had arrived in the enemy court with the specific orientation of someone who had been given access to the most important building in the kingdom's intelligence landscape and knew exactly what to do with it. She had not expected the bond. She had been in the court for 4 months when she had first felt it, the specific warm resonance of a bond frequency finding its match, the biological recognition that the ancient texts described as the specific sensation of something clicking into a configuration that had always been available and had just become actual. She had felt it from across a council chamber. During a formal session, she was attending in her cartographic archive capacity, and she had looked up and found Daran looking in her direction with the specific quality of someone who had just experienced a sensation they had not expected and was not going to acknowledge in a public setting. She had looked away. She had spent the following 2 years watching him not acknowledge the bond. She had not been angry about this, not initially, and not entirely even later. She had understood the specific position of a king whose bond frequency had just identified a low-status Omega archivist as its match. The political complications were real. The governance inconvenience was real. The pressure from the court's established power factions to form politically advantageous alliances rather than following bond recognition was both real and substantial. She had understood all of this. She had also understood, from the very beginning, That Daran's response to the bond's presence was to manage it by not engaging with it, which was the specific approach that allowed the question to remain perpetually deferred rather than resolved. He was good at deferring things he did not want to decide. She had watched this about him for 2 years and had built, from the observation, a specific understanding of who he was. A man whose governance was competent and whose personal accounting was significantly less so. A man who was better at making decisions when the decisions had clear metrics than when they required reckoning with the full human weight of what was being decided. The bond had been uncomfortable. Not the bond itself. The bond was the warmth she had been carrying for 2 years. The specific quality of feeling less alone in a court where she had been systematically invisible. The specific comfort of a connection that did not depend on being seen correctly by the person it connected her to. The discomfort was the specific quality of carrying a bond with someone who was managing it by treating it as if it were not there. She had made her peace with this, or something close enough to peace to be functional. When the selection process had placed her at the bottom of the assessment ranking, and the administrator had told her she had been chosen for the trade, she had done the specific internal accounting that the news required. She had thought about the bond, about the specific fact that Daran had a bond with her and had decided she was his most expendable court member, and she had felt the full weight of what that combination meant. She had felt it, and she had set it aside, and she had begun planning. Because the bond was real, and the dismissal was real, and both of them were true simultaneously. And the only thing she could control was what she did with the specific position the dismissal had placed her in. The enemy court's palace was reportedly the most architecturally complex building in the Eastern Territories. She had spent the 14 days before the trade reading every available document about its construction history. The enemy court had a name for what they thought she was, a treaty gift. The term was in their diplomatic language and carried the specific connotation of something received rather than taken. Something whose presence in their court communicated the giver's willingness to be cooperative. Treaty gifts occupied a specific social position in the Eastern Court's hierarchy, honored in the formal sense of being treated with consideration, restricted in the practical sense of being expected to remain within the designated areas of the palace that the court had decided were appropriate for diplomatic tributes. The designated areas included the residential wing, the communal gardens, the formal dining hall, and the state reception rooms where tributes were expected to be visible during official functions. The designated areas did not include the War Council chamber, the military planning rooms, the secure document archive, or the private corridors that connected the court's most senior members' quarters. The shadow architecture connected all of them. She had spent her first week in the surface mode, the visible, socially appropriate mode of a treaty gift, learning the rhythms of her new environment, attending the functions she was expected to attend, building the specific impression of someone who was adapting to her circumstances with the cooperative demeanor that the court had anticipated. She had been kind and quiet and attentive in the ways that people in her designated social position were expected to be kind and quiet and attentive, and the court had received her exactly as she had intended, as a non-threat, as a compliant addition to the diplomatic landscape, as a person whose presence was symbolic rather than functional. In the evenings, when the lamps were lit and the shadows arrived in full, she had begun her real work. The palace's shadow network was extraordinary. It was the most complex interior shadow architecture she had encountered. the specific product of a building that had been designed and modified and expanded over several centuries by architects who had not been thinking about shadow when they made their decisions and had therefore created, entirely without intention, a shadow network of magnificent richness. Every modification, every addition, every room built around an existing corner had produced new shadow geometries, new connections, new passages through the darkness that connected the palace's most significant spaces in ways that the official floor plans did not show. She had mapped it in her first week. Not with paper, the map lived in her memory, the specific gift of a spatial intelligence that was as accurate as any physical document and considerably safer. She had walked the shadow network in the first 7 evenings with the methodical thoroughness of someone surveying a new territory, cataloging every connection, every shadow pocket large enough to occupy, every dark corridor that ran adjacent to a significant meeting space. By the end of the first week, she had the complete shadow map of the palace memorized and had identified the 11 most strategically significant spaces she needed access to. She had begun attending meetings that she had not been invited to. The first significant intelligence had arrived on the 9th day, a war council discussion she had listened to from the shadow behind the eastern wall of the war council chamber, in which the council's senior members had outlined the broad strokes of a military campaign they were planning to conduct in the coming months. Not specific enough to be actionable, significant enough to confirm that what she had suspected from the diplomatic context was accurate. The treaty was not sincere. The Eastern Kingdom was negotiating for time while it prepared a military initiative that the treaty was designed to delay detection of. She had sat in the shadow and listened and filed every word in the specific, precise memory of someone who understood that this was exactly what she had come here to do. End of the first month, she had the full order of battle for the Eastern Kingdom's military forces, the specific deployment positions of every major unit, the command structure, the supply routes, the expected timeline. End of the second month, she had the target territories, the phased invasion plan, the political objectives. End of the third month, she had everything. The intelligence network she built in the enemy court was the most comprehensive she had ever assembled, and she had been building them in her imagination since she was old enough to understand what her gift was for. The War Council met 3 times a week. She attended all 3 sessions from the shadow behind the eastern wall and from the shadow beneath. The gallery window, depending on which council member was presenting and where in the room their voice carried most clearly. She had learned, in the first month, the specific acoustic properties of the chamber, which walls amplified, which absorbed, which positions in the shadow network allowed her to hear a conversation conducted at normal speaking volume without any risk of the speakers hearing the specific quality of presence that her shadow state did not entirely eliminate. She had developed her shadow walking over 22 years of practice, and it was very good. It was not perfect. The imperfection was the specific challenge of a gift that was designed to suppress visibility and sound and scent, but could not entirely suppress the very faint quality of displaced air that sustained shadow occupation produced in a completely enclosed space. This was not a problem in larger spaces or in rooms with any ambient movement. It was a potential problem in the small document archive room where the senior intelligence officer kept his most sensitive materials. Because the archive room was small and its air was still, and she had needed to enter it and spend extended time reading documents in shadow. She had solved this by developing the specific patience of someone who understood that the gift required the environment to cooperate, and that the way to make the environment cooperate was to move at the environment's pace rather than her own. She had spent 4 sessions in the archive room over 2 weeks, entering in the 20 minutes before the lamps were lit in the evening, and leaving in the 20 minutes before they were extinguished, using the ambient air movement of the lamp lighting and extinguishing to cover the specific quality of her entry and exit. She had read every document in the archive. The intelligence picture was complete in the 3rd month, and it was catastrophic. The Eastern Kingdom's military was not planning a conventional campaign. They were planning a decapitation strike, a rapid, coordinated assault designed to reach the capital in fewer than 4 days, using a specific route through the northern mountain passes that Daran's intelligence services had assessed as impassable in the spring season and had therefore left unguarded. The route was passable. The Eastern Kingdom's military engineers had been working on it for 2 years. The path was ready. If the army marched and Daran had no intelligence about the route, the capital would be under siege in 4 days. She had the full plan. She had the route, the timing, the troop numbers, the supply chain. The specific tactical approaches planned for each of the 3 defensive positions between the northern passes and the capital. She had all of it in her memory. She also had, in the evening of the day she completed her intelligence picture, the specific information that the army was going to march in 10 days. Not the originally projected timeline. Accelerated. Something had changed in the political calculation, and the timeline had been moved forward. 10 days. She had, at maximum, 8 days before she needed to begin the Dreamlink transmission to ensure Daran had time to deploy appropriate defenses. She went to the garden and sat in the shadow of the wall and thought about what 8 days meant for her body's readiness to transmit, and what the transmission would cost, and whether the cost was worth it. She thought about the farming villages along the projected invasion route. She thought about the children in those villages. She thought about what Daran had done, and what Daran's people had not done. And she made the distinction that was the most important distinction of her life. The people were not the king. She went back inside. She had 8 days to prepare for the most significant use of her gift she had ever attempted. The preparation for the dream link required the specific conditions of maximum physical and spiritual readiness she could achieve in the available time. Not rest exactly. The specific intensive preparation of someone who understood that what they were about to do would cost them enormously, and who was optimizing the conditions to make the cost survivable. She slept more than she needed to. She ate carefully. She spent 4 hours each day in the shadow network in the specific preparatory practice of moving through the palace's darkness at the deepest shadow engagement she could sustain comfortably. Not the full dreamlink depth, the intermediate depth. The level that exercised the gift's most significant capacity without depleting the reserves she needed to conserve for the transmission. She thought about the structure of the transmission. The dream link worked by projecting information through the shadow network to the shadow in the vicinity of the recipient, finding the darkness closest to the sleeping mind she was reaching for and using it as the delivery point. Distance attenuated the signal and required greater effort to maintain. 300 miles was significantly farther than she had transmitted before. The battle map was significantly more complex than anything she had transmitted before. Both variables combined meant the transmission would be at the limit of what she could do. She had arrived at a specific decision on the 5th day of preparation. She was going to transmit. Not because she had forgiven Daran. She had not forgiven Daran. Not because the bond had reasserted itself in any way that softened the specific injury of being traded away as an expendable diplomatic token. It had not. The injury was present, and she was carrying it with the clear-eyed accuracy of someone who had been carrying difficult, accurate information for 2 decades and had not learned to make it more comfortable by distorting it. Welcome back to the Alpha King Daran channel. Today I'm bringing you a brand new and incredibly captivating story that will surely enthrall you if you listen to the whole video. The story is entirely fictional. The video is created using AI, and it's designed to provide value, entertainment, and positive education for viewers aged 13 and up. Now, let's dive into today's story. She was going to transmit because she had spent 3 months in the shadow architecture of an enemy court and had built from that 3 months a picture of what was coming. And the people who lived along the invasion route had not traded her. The farmers in the northern territories had not assessed her as their most expendable member. The children in the villages that would burn if the Eastern Army reached them had not signed the treaty that sent her here. She was going to transmit for them. The decision was clean once she framed it accurately. This was not about Daran and her. This was about 4,000 people in the invasion route's projected territory and what happened to them in 10 days if no one with accurate intelligence intervened. She had the intelligence. She was going to use it. On the 7th day of preparation, she confirmed the Army's departure timeline through a final War Council session she attended from the shadow. The march was in 3 days. She needed to transmit tonight. She went to the deepest shadow in the palace, the ancient cellar beneath the east wing, a space of complete darkness that had been built 300 years ago and had not been significantly used since. A shadow so deep and so old that she could feel it communicating with the shadow network of the entire Eastern Kingdom. A resonance point from which the transmission could reach across the distance to Daran's palace with the maximum available power. She sat in the old darkness. She breathed. She opened the gift to its deepest accessible level. She found Daran. Finding him across 300 miles of shadow took 11 minutes. She felt the shadow network's response the way she felt all shadow, as direction and depth and connection. The specific sensation of a path becoming available through the darkness that connected her cellar to the night sky, and the night sky to the darkness of another building, and the darkness of that building to the specific shadow of a sleeping chamber, where a king was dreaming of something bureaucratic and unimportant. She found the shadow in his chamber, and she began. The transmission was not like speaking. It was more like building, the specific construction of a complex information structure in the shadow space, and then projecting it with sufficient force that the sleeping mind at the other end received it not as a dream's usual impressionistic fragments, but as a coherent, detailed, experientially complete delivery of information. She had to hold every element of the battle plan in her own mind simultaneously, while projecting it. The way a musician held every note of a complex piece while playing it, the troop numbers, the route through the northern passes, the specific tactical approach at each defensive position, the timing, the supply chain, the command hierarchy, the full strategic logic of the decapitation plan. She held it all. She projected it into the shadow beside Daran's sleeping form. She felt the transmission land, the specific sensation of information making contact with a receiving mind, the recognition that the projection had been received rather than bouncing back or dissipating. She held the connection open and continued building, the visual map of the route, the specific terrain features, the places where a prepared defense could intercept and break the momentum of an advancing army that believed it was operating in secret. She gave him everything. It took 47 minutes. She had transmitted intelligence packages before, small ones, simple ones, the specific early uses of the dream link that had taught her its mechanics. Those had cost her the specific tiredness of sustained concentration and had required a day's rest. This cost her everything she had. The depletion arrived the moment she released the connection, not gradually. The full weight of 47 minutes of maximum depth gift operation arriving simultaneously. The specific profound exhaustion of someone whose life force reserves had been operating at their limit and had just exceeded it. She felt the darkness of the cellar differently in the aftermath, not as the familiar navigable substance of her gift's element, but as the darkness of someone who was very depleted sitting in a very dark place. She sat in the ancient cellar for a long time. She thought about Daran receiving the map in his sleep and waking with it in his mind and not knowing where it had come from. She thought, he is going to win the war. She thought, the people in the invasion route's villages are going to live. She thought, that was worth this. She sat in the darkness until she could stand, and then she stood, and she went to bed, and she slept for 14 hours, and when she woke the gift was present but muted, the shadow still readable but at low sensitivity, the specific quality of something that needed time to recover. She rested. The army marched in 3 days as planned. 2 weeks later, she heard through the diplomatic channels that the Eastern Kingdom's army had been intercepted in the northern passes by a defensive formation of exceptional precision. That the battle had been decisive. That Daran's forces had won. That the Eastern commander had said, in the specific stunned way of a man whose best plan had just failed completely, that the enemy had known everything. Vale heard this and felt nothing that required expression. She rested for 3 more weeks. Then she left. The dream arrived at the 3rd hour of the night, and Daran woke from it immediately, fully, without the gradual surfacing of ordinary sleep. He lay in his bed with the battle map in his mind, not a dream's fragmentary impressions. A complete and detailed intelligence package that occupied his waking awareness with the specific clarity of information he had been briefed on rather than information he had dreamed. The troop numbers, the route, the timeline, the tactical approach at each defensive position, the supply chain, every piece of intelligence that his military command had been unable to gather because no conventional scout could have entered the enemy court's secure planning spaces. He called his war council before dawn. He presented the intelligence with the specific controlled quality of a king who had just received something he could not explain and who understood that the council's confidence depended on his appearing to have an intelligence source rather than appearing to have woken from a dream with a battle map. He said the intelligence was from a confirmed source he was not at liberty to name. He said the source's reliability was absolute. He said the battle plan required immediate deployment to the northern passes. The council had looked at the intelligence's specific detail, the kind of precision that only came from inside the enemy's planning rooms, and had understood that whatever the source was, it was real. They had deployed. The battle had been, by his war council's unanimous assessment, the most successful defensive engagement in the kingdom's history, a perfect interception of a force that had expected surprise and encountered instead a defense that knew exactly where it was coming, how it was deployed, and what it was planning to do. The Eastern commander's post-battle statement that the enemy had known everything had circulated. through the diplomatic channels with the specific destabilizing force of intelligence victories that left the defeated party uncertain about who in their own court had betrayed them. No one in the Eastern Court had betrayed them. The investigation had begun 3 days after the battle's conclusion, when his senior intelligence officer had come to him with the specific quality of someone who had spent 3 days trying to explain something and had arrived at an answer they were not certain how to present. The officer had said, "The intelligence does not match any of our existing source profiles." He had said, "The specificity of the battle plan's detail is consistent with extended access to the enemy's highest security planning spaces over a period of several months." He had said, "The only person with potential extended access to those spaces who has a connection to this court is..." He had stopped. Daran had said, "Say it." The officer had said, "The diplomatic tribute." He had said, "The Omega we sent to the Eastern Court as part of the treaty terms." He had said, "She has been in the Eastern Palace for 4 months." He had said, "If her gift capacity was different from what the registry showed, significantly different, she would have had access to every planning space in that palace." Daran had looked at the battle map. He had looked at it for a long time. He had thought about the woman he had signed a paper about without knowing her name. He had thought about the bond, the specific warm resonance that he had been managing by not engaging with it for 2 years, that he had been managing well enough that he had been able to make the trade decision without it interfering. He had thought about the fact that he had made the trade decision without it interfering. He had thought about what that said about him and had not found the answer comfortable. He said, "Where is she now?" The officer said, "We do not know, my lord." He said, "The Eastern Court has reported that she departed without warning approximately 3 weeks after the battle." He said, "They have been unable to locate her." Daran said, "She is coming back on her own terms." The officer said, "My lord?" He said, "She will come back when she is ready and not before." He said it with the specific certainty of a man who had spent 2 years in the vicinity of a person and had understood almost nothing about her and was now, in the light of what the intelligence investigation had revealed, revising that assessment with the full available evidence. He said, "When she arrives, bring her to me immediately." He said, "And bring me her full original file, not the registry summary, every document." He was going to find out who he had traded. The full file took 2 days to compile. Not because it was large. It was not large. The specific thin file of a person whose presence in the court had been assessed as low priority and whose documentation reflected that assessment. It was thin because the court's documentation system documented what it assessed as significant and had not assessed Vale as significant, which meant the file contained her arrival records, her assignment documentation, her annual performance assessments from the Cartographic Archive Division, and the trade selection paperwork. The trade selection paperwork. He read it in the private study, where he read things he needed to read without the governance. Performance available to deflect what the reading produced. The selection criteria, the numerical weights, the scores, her score. The administrator's notation that her selection had been made on the basis of lowest strategic cost to the court's political relationships. Strategic cost, lowest. He had traded her because she was the person in his court whose loss would cost him the least. He read this and sat with it. He had been doing this for 4 days now, this specific private accounting, sitting with what the full file produced without managing it. He had been governing for 11 years, and he was good at governing, decisive, clear-headed, able to process complex information under pressure and produce coherent decisions with appropriate speed. He had been governing well, and he had been doing it in a specific way that the file in front of him was now demonstrating with clarity, required him not to look too closely at specific categories of decision. The bond had been present for 2 years. He had felt it the first time in the council chamber and had assessed it as a governance complication and had filed it in the category of things that he was not going to act on because acting on them required reckoning with the full human weight of what was being decided, and he had a specific capacity for not acting on things in that category that he had been developing since his first year of governance. He had traded her for diplomatic convenience. He had traded someone he was bonded to, whose actual gift capacity was radically different from the registry's classification, who had been in his court for 3 years demonstrating a spatial precision in her archival work that should have prompted him, to ask whether the passive environmental sensitivity on her registry entry was the complete picture. He had not asked. No one had asked. He had signed the paper with her name on it, and had felt the bond register its objection, and had managed the objection with the specific competence he had been applying to it for 2 years. And she had walked into the enemy kingdom and done the most significant intelligence work the kingdom had received in his 11 years of governance. For the kingdom's people. Not for him. He was certain of this in the specific way that he was certain of things that were uncomfortable and true. She had not transmitted the battle map for him. She had transmitted it because the people in the invasion route's territories did not deserve to bear the cost of what he had done. He had read the intelligence investigation's conclusions, and he had understood what the transmission had cost. The dream link at that scale and distance had been at the absolute limit of survivable use, and she had survived it. And she had been recovering for 3 weeks in an enemy court where she had no allies before she had felt well enough to leave. She had done all of this. He had traded her for the cost of not inconveniencing his political relationships. He put the file on the desk and looked at it for a long time. He thought, whatever she requires when she returns, I am going to give her. He thought, and I am going to start by actually knowing who she is. He called the intelligence officer and said, I want everything the investigation produced about the scope of what she did in the enemy court. He said, every piece of intelligence she gathered, every session she attended, every document she accessed. He said, I want the full account. She arrived at the palace gates on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the battle, traveling alone and on foot from the eastern border crossing she had departed from 6 months ago. The guards recognized her from the diplomatic records and sent a runner immediately. She was not in any hurry. She waited at the gate's visitor reception area with the specific unhurried quality of someone who had done what they came to do and was now returning at a pace that suited them rather than anyone else's timeline. She had recovered fully from the Dreamlink's depletion. The 3 weeks in the enemy court and the 3 weeks of slow travel had produced the specific gradual restoration she had needed, and she was at her full baseline capacity again. The shadow gift operating at its normal passive level. The enemy palace's shadow architecture and memory she carried with the same precision as every other spatial memory she had accumulated over 22 years of practice. She was aware of the political dynamics her return was producing. The runners were fast, and the court was organized, and she had been at the gate for 20 minutes when the first indication of the political response arrived. Not Daran's senior administrator, who should have been the appropriate welcome function, but Lord Savin's senior aide, arriving at the gate with the specific quality of someone who had been sent quickly and with specific instructions about what to communicate. Lord Savin had been the faction's head who had recommended her selection for the trade. She received the aid with the specific composed attention she gave to all situations that required accurate reading. The aide said, "Lord Savin wishes to welcome the returned treaty tribute and to offer his personal assistance in her reintegration to the court." She said, "I appreciate the welcome." She said it with the specific neutral quality of someone receiving information rather than responding to it. She understood what the welcome meant. Savin's faction had recommended her for the trade on the basis of her low assessed value. The intelligence investigation's conclusions, which would have circulated through the courts, informal information channels within days of being completed, had established that her assessed value had been radically incorrect. Savin's faction stood to be significantly damaged by the full account of the trade's reasoning becoming part of the court's formal record. The welcome was an attempt to establish a relationship that might produce a more managed version of what she knew. She said, "I will look forward to speaking with Lord Savin at an appropriate time." She said, "My first meeting is with the king." The aide's expression had the specific quality of someone receiving an answer that was technically courteous and practically unmanageable. Daran's senior administrator arrived 4 minutes later and escorted her inside. The political crisis had been building since the intelligence investigation's conclusions circulated. She had been tracking its outlines through the specific informal intelligence channels that travelers carried, the news that moved between border settlements and capital through the ordinary social fabric of a kingdom's connected communities. Savin's faction was not the only party with an interest in the framing. There were 3 distinct factions whose positions in the court were implicated by the specific facts of what had happened, each of them working to establish a narrative in the weeks before her return that would serve their interests better than the accurate account. She had noted this. She had noted it with the specific calm of someone who had spent 6 months in an enemy court doing intelligence work and who was not going to be outmaneuvered by domestic factions whose methods were considerably more transparent than the enemy war councils. Lord Savin's formal petition arrived before she had her first meeting with Daran. She learned about it from the senior administrator who was escorting her, a man who had the specific quality of someone who had been in institutional service for a long time and had developed the specific gift of communicating significant information with appropriate brevity. He said, "There has been a formal petition submitted to the court this morning." He said, "Lord Savin's petition requests that any public account of the Eastern Treaty's execution be submitted to the formal diplomatic review process before entering the court's official record." He said, "The petition cites concerns about the treaty relationship with the Eastern Kingdom and the potential diplomatic consequences of disclosing intelligence gathering activities that occurred under diplomatic cover." She said, "The diplomatic review process is chaired by Lord Savin's faction." The administrator said, "Yes." She said, "The petition's effect, if granted, would be to route any account I give through a process controlled by the people who selected me for the trade." The administrator said, "Yes." She said, "And the petition was submitted this morning, before I had my first meeting with the king." The administrator said, "Yes." He said it with the specific quality of someone confirming information they understood was being assessed rather than merely received. She said, "The meeting with the king is when?" He said, "Now." She said, "Good." The petition was the specific political move she had anticipated from Savin's direction since she had heard about the intelligence investigation's conclusions, the specific move of a faction that needed the narrative to be controlled before it could be examined. She had been thinking about the appropriate response since she crossed the border. The appropriate response was simple. She was going to give the full account to the full court, and she was going to give it before the petition's procedural process could establish itself as the appropriate channel. The petition had been submitted that morning. The court's full formal assembly convened when the king requested it. The question was whether Daran would request it. She walked into his private receiving room and looked at him for the first time in 6 months, and felt the bond resonating between them with the specific warm persistence of something that had been present for 2 years and had not weakened during her absence. And she said, "Before anything else, I need you to convene the full court." He said, "Yes." He said it immediately, without the governance calculation that she had watched precede his decisions for 2 years. He said, "I have been waiting for you to arrive to do exactly that." She looked at him. He said, "I read your file." He said, "The full investigation." He said, "Every meeting you attended in the enemy court, every document you read, everything the investigation could reconstruct of what you spent 6 months doing." She said, "And?" He said, "And I need to say something to you before the full court hears anything." He said, "I traded you without knowing who you were." He said, "I signed the paper with your name on it without reading the file, without reviewing the registry entry, without asking a single question about the person I was sending away as a diplomatic convenience." He said, "I am not presenting this as an accounting." He said, "I am presenting it as a statement of accurate fact before we go into a court session where the political factions will be trying to control the framing." He said, "I want you to hear it from me without management before you hear anything from anyone else." She looked at him. She said, "I hear it." She said, "We will have the full conversation after the court session." She said, "The petition is what needs to be addressed first." He said, "The petition has been denied." She said, "On what grounds?" He said, "On the grounds that the decision to trade a court member is a governance decision made by the king, and the accounting for that decision is the king's accountability, rather than a diplomatic review process's jurisdiction." He said, "Savin's faction does not have the authority to review a governance decision I made." She looked at him for a moment. She said, "Good." He said, "The full court convenes in 1 hour." She said, "Yes." The full court had 64 members. She stood at the chamber's center, and she told them everything from the beginning. Not from the trade, from before the trade. She told them about 3 years in the cartographic archive and the specific quality of her invisibility in the court's assessment framework and the gift registry entry that had described the shadow walking as environmental sensitivity because she had learned, before she arrived at Daran's court, what happened to practitioners who disclosed gifts that made authority figures uncomfortable. She told them about the bond. She told them that it had been present for 2 years, and that the person she was bonded to had managed it by not engaging with it, which she understood, and which did not change what it had meant to carry it. She told them about the trade selection process, the criteria, the weights, the scores, the administrator's notation that she had been chosen because she was the lowest strategic cost. She told them about the enemy court. She told them in the specific organized way she told all things that required accurate transmission. What she had done, how she had done it, what she had found, what she had decided when she found it. She told them about the 3 months of shadow intelligence gathering. She told them about the battle plan. She told them about the 10-day timeline and the 3-day countdown and the Dreamlink decision and what the Dreamlink had cost. She told them about waking in the ancient cellar 47 minutes after she began the transmission and sitting in the darkness until she could stand. She told them about the farming families in the invasion route's projected territory and why she had transmitted for them rather than for Daran. She said this clearly and without the edge that the distinction could have carried. She said, "I want this court to understand the accurate account of why the battle was won." She said, "It was won because a person the court had assessed as expendable was sent to the most strategically significant location in the enemy kingdom and used the gift the court had not bothered to accurately assess to gather intelligence that no conventional spy service could have gathered." She said, "I am not presenting this as a grievance." She said, "I am presenting this as the accurate record. Because the accurate record is what this court needs to make the governance decisions that follow." Lord Savan said, "The treaty." Daran said, "Lord Savan will not speak during this presentation." The court was quiet. She said, "The full account is in the record." She said, "The king will respond." Daran stood at the court's center. He had been thinking about what to say since the day the intelligence officer had confirmed the source of the battle map. He had been revising it and refining it and arriving at the same conclusion every time. The thing that needed to be said was the thing that was true, and the thing that was true was not comfortable. He said, "I traded a court member as a diplomatic token without reviewing her file, without reading her registry entry beyond the summary classification, and without speaking to her once before I signed the paper with her name on it." He said, "The classification on her registry entry was inaccurate because the court's disclosure environment is not safe for practitioners of gifts that authority structures find threatening." He said, "She had learned, before she arrived here, not to fully disclose what she carried." He said, "The court's climate produced that specific rational decision in a person with an invisible gift. And the court's climate produced it because this court has been operating for years with a gift assessment framework that is better at identifying conventional power displays than at identifying capacities that do not perform themselves visibly." He said, "I traded her." He said, "The trade sent her into the most strategically significant location in the enemy kingdom." He said, "She spent 6 months in that location, gathering the most complete intelligence picture this court has ever received about any military threat." He said, "She transmitted that intelligence to me at a cost to herself that the investigation has established was at the absolute limit of survivable gift use." He said, "The battle was won by the woman I traded." He said, "Lord Savan's faction recommended her selection for the trade on the basis of the assessment framework's valuation of her." He said, "The assessment framework was wrong." He said, "The faction's recommendation was made in good faith on the basis of a framework that this court created, and this court is responsible for." He said, "The formal investigation into the trade selection process and the assessment framework's systematic failures will be conducted with full transparency, and its findings will be presented to this court." He said, "The findings will determine whether the trade selection process requires governance accountability beyond what I am personally accountable for." He said, "Vale will address the court with her formal requirements." Savan's aide began to speak. Daran said, "The faction's formal position on this matter will be received after the requirements have been presented." He said it with the specific flat authority of someone who had made a decision and was communicating it rather than proposing it. The aide stopped. She stepped forward. She presented 3 requirements. The Shadow Intelligence Corps, a formal intelligence institution whose practitioners were identified and trained in gifts the conventional registry could not assess, with the specific emphasis on invisible capacities, shadow gifts, perception gifts, information processing gifts that produced no dramatic visible output, and that the existing framework had consistently misclassified or missed entirely. The Corps' authority would include the right to conduct intelligence assessments independent of the conventional registry's classification system, with a protected full disclosure protocol that ensured practitioners could accurately describe their capacities without the specific social and institutional consequences that had been producing systematic underdisclosure for decades. She said, the battle was won by a practitioner whose gift the registry classified as minor. She said, the Corps exists to ensure this specific failure cannot occur again, the failure of a governance structure that cannot count what it cannot see. The gift registry reform, a comprehensive revision of the registry's assessment methodology, removing the dependency on visible performance indicators and establishing a separate evaluation track for non-display capacities, with protected disclosure protocols and a formal prohibition on using gift assessments for trade selection without individual review and consent. She said, the trade selection process used the registry's assessment as its primary criterion. She said, the registry's assessment was wrong because the registry's methodology cannot identify what it cannot observe. She said, the reform addresses the methodology. She said, the prohibition addresses the use. The formal consent requirement for trade, written governance provision establishing that no court member could be included in a diplomatic trade arrangement without individual review of their full capacity. Individual notification with adequate time for legal consultation, and individual consent recorded in the formal diplomatic documents. She said, I was notified 14 days before the handover. She said, I had no legal consultation. She said, my consent was not requested. She said, this is the specific failure the provision addresses. She said, these 3 requirements address what failed. She said, they are not conditions for my continued presence here. They are what this governance structure needs to exist, whether I am in it or not. Lord Savan said, from his position in the Assembly, the diplomatic implications of the treaty. She said, the Eastern Treaty is dissolved. She said it with the specific flat accuracy of someone stating a legal fact. She said, the Eastern Kingdom launched a military campaign against this kingdom under the cover of a treaty that was negotiated in bad faith. She said, the treaty's dissolution is the legal consequence of that bad faith. She said, the diplomatic implications of a dissolved treaty are not relevant to the governance reforms being proposed. Savan was quiet. The court received the requirements. The Shadow Intelligence Corps was established 40 days after the full court session. She had spent those 40 days doing 3 things simultaneously: working with the court's legal drafters on the specific language of the registry reform and the consent provision, conducting the initial identification assessment of current court members whose registry classifications might be inaccurate, and building the Corps' founding operational framework from the principles she had been developing in her head since she was 8 years old in a barn, and understood that what she could do was something the world would not accurately assess. The Registry Reform Identification Assessment produced 7 practitioners whose classifications were significantly inaccurate. Not just minor discrepancies, significant systematic undervaluation. In 6 of the 7 cases, because the practitioners had made the same rational disclosure calculation she had made, that fully disclosing invisible gifts in an environment that could not see them accurately was an exposure without corresponding benefit. The 7th case was different. A practitioner who had tried to fully disclose and had been reclassified by the registry assessor as delusional because the capacity they described was outside the assessor's existing framework. She had spent 2 days with that practitioner. She had said, "Tell me what you can do." The practitioner had told her. She had said, "I believe you." She had said, "The core needs what you carry." The practitioner had looked at her with the specific expression of someone who had been waiting for that sentence for a very long time. The founding cohort of the Shadow Intelligence Corps was 8 practitioners, including herself. The gift profiles represented were shadow walking, dream sight, structural resonance, memory echo, environmental communion, temporal impression, document sensitivity, and the 7th practitioner's capacity, which she was calling perceptual bridge until the practitioner found a name they preferred. None of these were gifts the conventional registry had a primary classification for. All of them were real. The consent provision had been formally enacted and was part of the diplomatic framework. The registry reform was in its implementation phase. Daran had been present at every working session without being part of them, the specific observing. Presence of someone who had decided that this was not his process to direct, and who was choosing to learn from it rather than govern it. She had noted this. She had noted the difference between this version of his engagement and the version she had watched for 3 years before the trade. On the 41st day, she had come to the session's end and found him still in the room when the drafters had left. He said, "The investigation into Savan's faction." She said, "Yes." He said, "The findings are in." He said, "The faction's recommendation was made in good faith on the basis of the assessment framework." He said, "The framework is the governance failure." He said, "Savan is not individually culpable for a systematic failure he did not create." She said, "I know." She said, "I said so at the full court session." He said, "I know." He said, "I want to make sure that the investigation's conclusion is consistent with what you said rather than more convenient to me politically." She looked at him. She said, "It is consistent." He said, "Good." She said, "You checked to make sure the finding was accurate rather than politically convenient." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is new." He said, "Yes." The evening of the 42nd day, she was in the Corps' founding chamber, the room that had been converted from a secondary archive space into the operational center of the kingdom's first shadow intelligence institution, which she found appropriate in the specific way that things were appropriate when they had a genuine relationship to what they represented. She was reviewing the registry reform's implementation progress when Daran came in. He said, "I need to say something." She set the document down. He said, "The bond." He said, "I have been managing it by not engaging with it since the first time I felt it in the council chamber 2 years ago." He said, "I managed it because engaging with it was complicated, and I had developed a specific capacity for not engaging with things that required me to carry the full human weight of what was being decided." He said, "I traded you." He said it with the flat quality of someone who had been saying these words to himself for weeks and, was saying them to her with the specific conviction of having arrived at the accurate statement rather than the manageable one. He said, "I traded someone I was bonded to because the governance calculation made her appear to be my most expendable court member, and I allowed the governance calculation to proceed without the full human weight that the decision about a specific person required." She said, "Yes." He said, "I am not asking you to forgive this." He said, "I do not know whether it is forgiven is the right question." He said, "What I am asking is whether, given the full accounting, the trade and the 6 months and the dream link and what you chose to do with all of it, there is a version of what we might be to each other that you are willing to consider." She looked at him. She had been building the evidence base for 42 days. She had been building a version of it for 2 years before the trade. She was a person who assessed carefully and decided on the basis of what the assessment produced. And the assessment she had been conducting since her return had been producing specific and consistent results that she had been watching accumulate with the specific patience of someone who understood that evidence accumulation was not something to rush. She said, "The evidence I have been building since I returned." He said, "Yes." She said, "It is not complete." She said, "I have been watching you for 42 days, and you have been different from the version of you I watched for 2 years before the trade." She said, "The difference is consistent and it is specific and it is not performed." She said, "But 42 days is not sufficient to establish that the difference is durable." He said, "What would be sufficient?" She said, "I do not know yet." She said, "I will know when I get there." He said, "I will be here." She said, "I know." She said, "That is one piece of the evidence." She looked at the shadow that fell from the window's edge across the chamber floor, the shadow network of the palace communicating its specific awareness through her gift's passive perception. The darkness familiar and navigable and genuinely hers in the way that things were genuinely yours when they were part of what you were. She said, "The bond is present." He said, "Yes." She said, "I know." She said, "I have been feeling it for 2 years." She said, "I will feel it accurately when I am ready to act on it." He said, "Yes." She said, "Go." She said, "There is a session in the morning, and I have preparation to finish." He went. She sat in the chamber with the shadow network's ambient awareness around her, and thought about evidence and patience, and the specific quality of something being built from accurate materials rather than from what was wished for. And she returned to the documents, and she worked until the preparation was complete. 2 years forward. The Shadow Intelligence Corps had 17 practitioners and had conducted 41 intelligence operations in 2 years, not all of them the scale of the Eastern Campaign. Not all of them requiring the specific capacities that the founding cohort carried. Some were as simple as sending a practitioner with structural resonance capacity into a building, where a negotiation was being conducted to assess whether the building's walls had been modified to allow eavesdropping. Some were as complex as the 6-month embedded intelligence operation in the Western Territories that had produced the most detailed picture of the Western border situation any court had possessed in 30 years. None of them had required anyone to be traded. The consent provision had been invoked 3 times, not to prevent trades, but to ensure that when diplomatic arrangements required individual court members to serve in other kingdoms' courts, those individuals were fully assessed, fully informed, fully consenting, and fully equipped with accurate documentation of what they could do and what they would need to do it. The registry reform had reclassified 47 practitioners in 2 years. Not all of them had joined the Corps. Many of the reclassified gifts were not intelligence-oriented, and the Corps was not the appropriate home for all of them. But all 47 had received accurate documentation for the first time, and accurate documentation was the specific foundation that everything else was built on. The ability to be assigned appropriate work, to receive appropriate protection, to be assessed by governance structures as what you actually were rather than as what the structures had been able to observe. Savin's faction had reorganized after the investigation's findings, not dissolved, reorganized, with the specific internal reckoning of a political group that had operated within a framework that was now formally established as having been inadequate, and that had to decide whether to continue operating in the same framework's successor or to develop new principles. Some of them had. The faction's senior members who had engaged genuinely with the registry reform's implementation process were, a year later, among its most effective advocates. Vale was in the Corps' founding chamber on a morning in the second autumn when Daran came in and sat at the table where she was reviewing the Western Territories intelligence synthesis. He said, "The Northern Border Assessment." She said, "I read it this morning." He said, "The Corps' recommendation." She said, "The recommendation is in the third section." She said, Practitioner Mavin's shadow analysis of the border fortifications identified 3 structural weaknesses the conventional survey missed. She said, "I have authorized the defensive engineers to review the Corps' findings." He said, "You authorized without consulting me." She said, "The authorization falls within the Corps' operational independence provisions." She said, "I notified you." He said, "Yes." He said, "I know." He said, "I was noting it, not challenging it." She said, "Good." She looked at him across the table, the full quality of her attention. The same attention she gave to everything that required accurate assessment. She had been building the evidence base for 2 years now. She had not announced a conclusion, which was not because the evidence was insufficient. It was because she was a person who took the time that things required, rather than rushing them, because they were ready to be rushed. She said, "Daran." He said, "Yes." She said, "The evidence base is complete." He was very still. She said, 2 years. She said, "Consistent, specific, not performed." She said, "You have been different from the version of yourself you were before the trade in every interaction that has been available to me for observation." She said, "The difference has not wavered and has not required my presence to sustain." He said, "What does complete mean?" She said, "It means I am ready to acknowledge the bond." She said, formally, with full awareness of the history and what it contains. She said, "I am not proposing that the history is resolved. It is in the record and will remain there, and I would not want it removed." She said, "I am proposing that the bond is present, and I am now willing to be in the same relationship with it that you are." He looked at her. He said, "I have been in relationship with it since the first time I felt it in the council chamber." She said, "Yes." She said, "So have I." She said, "I have simply been doing it from the outside." He said, "And now?" She said, "And now I am willing to do it from the inside." Outside the chamber's window, the palace's daily activities continued their specific morning rhythm, the practitioners arriving at the Corps' entrance, the administrative staff moving through the corridors, the shadow network of the palace sending its constant ambient awareness through her gift's passive perception. The shadow was everywhere, as it always had been, navigable, connected. Genuinely hers in the way that things were genuinely yours when they had been part of you your entire life. She had walked into the enemy kingdom in darkness, and had sent the war home through it, and had built something from what she found when she returned. And the kingdom's practitioners, who had been invisible, were visible now. And the gift registry counted what it had not counted before. And the Shadow Intelligence Core was a permanent feature of the kingdom's intelligence landscape rather than a temporary crisis response. She thought, the Shadow did what it has always done. It carried what needed to be carried to where it needed to go. She thought, and the light that followed was worth it. Her story has come to an end, but our journey together continues. If you found this story inspiring and meaningful, please like the video to support me. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next empowering stories. And if you have any thoughts about the characters, her journey, or want to share your own story, please comment below. I really look forward to reading and chatting with you.